remember to buy a copy of your favorite books from the Cheeky Merchant. If we don't have it, we'll source it for you, but we'll definitely find the book for you. Hi, Cheeky Natives! Welcome to another episode of the Cheeky Natives. We are on a roll. Today's guest is chosen, or the book was chosen by Letlokonolo, and Letlokonolo felt that they could not be alone in their hurt in reading this book, and so they recruited me to join them, and I'm so grateful because this is such a beautiful and this is such an amazing book. So Letlokonolo, you've done, even though you broke the mandate about the kind of books we should, I appreciate it because this was such a fantastic book. How are you doing, Klochi?
I want to say I apologize for not executing the mandate, but after I read this book, I was like, you have to experience what I've experienced, right? And I know for certain there was a point. That point where you stopped in the book is the exact point where I said, I'm taking a break. I can't do this no more. And I'm just saying, I've told the author personally, I said, I'm a fight you.
Fight. We actually have to fight. I am ready. I'm ready to fight. And Letlokonolo, I hope you're ready as well, because why? Anyway, we'll talk about the whys later. Let me introduce our author before we start fighting with him. Today's author is Dr. Okechukwu Nzelu, who is a Manchester-based writer who in 2015 was the recipient of a Northern Writers Award from New Writing North. His debut novel, which the Cheeky Natives have read, is The Private Joys of Nena Maloney, which won a Betty Task Award. It was also shortlisted for the Desmond Elliott Prize and the Polari First Book Prize. In 2021, it was selected for the Kingston University Big Read. His second novel, which is why we are here today, Here Again Now, was shortlisted for the Royal Society of Literature Encore Award, the Polari Prize, the Jalal Prize, and the Diverse Book Awards. He's made several appearances on national radio and is a regular contributor to Kinfolk magazine. He is a non-executive director of ALCS and CLA and lecturer in creative writing at Lancaster University. Welcome, Okechukwu. Welcome to the Cheeky Natives. We're so excited to have this conversation with you.
Thank you so much for inviting me. And I've got my boxing gloves on. I'm ready to fight. I'm taking out my earrings. Let's go. I'm ready.
Okay. Wow. First of all, like this book was just okay. It's fine. I've read the book. I need to just process certain things for myself. But this book is in many ways a meditation on grief, right? So it feels like a very particular kind of meditation on grief. And what we see in the book is how people deal with their grief. And I think post-COVID, are we even post-COVID? But following the events of COVID, we're really seeing that people are grappling with the question around grief, right? How do we grieve the things that we've lost in the physical, but how do we grieve the things that we don't have language for, so the intangible things? And I wanted to speak a little bit about grief in this book as a recurring theme, but also the grief, the loss of the intangible, right? Because we see them lose things that we can't name. We see them lose friendships. We see them lose the versions of themselves that they could have been had they not experienced the things that they did. There's no word for that. What is it to imagine who you could have been? How do you grieve that person? But also, how do you grieve the relationships between people who should have loved you, who didn't in the ways that you needed to be loved? And so I wanted us to speak a little bit about why this is a recurring theme throughout the book, particularly with the characters that I've spoken to.
Yeah, gosh, thank you so much. It's so nice to have the book read and engaged with so thoughtfully. It means so much to me. So thank you so much, both of you. I think you've really hit the nail on the head there when you talk about the different kinds of grief that the novel involves, because you're absolutely right. There is so much in the novel which can't be named, that we don't really have names for. Certainly in English, this idea of the friends who are more than friends, but they're not quite in a steady romantic relationship, and what happens when that's lost, and the father-son kind of relationship, but they're not genetically related, and they're not, one of them is not the father of the other, one of them is not the son of the other. What does that even mean? And then there are things that we don't have names for, which perhaps it would be useful for us to have names for, because then we can, sometimes naming things allows us to grieve and mourn them better, because we can see the place in our lives that those things once held, and then we can think about ways to grow around that void. And then I think there are things that we have no names for, which I'm not entirely sure how to approach. We have the fact that there's Chibike, the father figure in this book, he has this kind of longing to be outside of the constraints of masculinity. He sees like women hugging on a a station platform, and he thinks, God, I wish I could have that. And there isn't really a name for that. In English, certainly, there isn't really a name for that longing. And I guess I was working around the fact that there are some things which we have no names for, which can be quite useful, and some things which we have no names for, which maybe it would be better for us if we just addressed the void. Really what I'm talking about, I guess, is a void rather than a thing itself. What Chibike feels is he's missing something, and we have a name for what he's missing. It's companionship. You have a name, it's authenticity, it's freedom. And we have names for those things, however tricky and broad those names are. But the not having of those things, I guess, is a little bit tricky to pin down. And I think you're absolutely right to think about COVID. I wrote this novel largely during COVID. I'd had the idea for it long before, but the actual writing of it, a lot of it happened during lockdowns, during the pandemic. And I think that really influenced a lot of the writing, in that I think this novel is quite claustrophobic. It feels that way to me, and that there's a lot of time spent in a small number of spaces, certainly in the flat that Achike owns. And if you think about, even, I wasn't consciously trying to write a COVID novel, but I think that things like the fact that they sit outside at a restaurant in December in England, that is not something that you routinely do unless you have no other option. And so I think when you're talking about grief, I was fortunate not to lose anybody close to me during that time, but it was all around. I had a student of mine whose granddad died, and there were people dying all around. It was on the news, it was everywhere. And the threat of death was everywhere. Certainly at the very beginning, we were all I remember being very afraid, for myself, for people I knew, and that was definitely part of it. And I think also was my own relationship with my father. I don't talk about this a lot, but my father left when I was about 14 for lots of complicated reasons, and we haven't had a relationship since then. And while I feel that thanks to therapy and and some very supportive people in my life, I have been able to recover from that and grow and move on and grow around that, there is a kind of there's a lot there that I have no language for, no easy language for. I can talk to my therapist about it and talk to my friends about it, but I couldn't say what I'm missing is this one thing, right? Or this is how I feel about it in one word. And I think part of growing up around that and trying to recover from that has been accepting that there are things that evade me, that I can't pin under my thumb in an easy way, straight away, or maybe ever. And I think that definitely fed into the novel, because so much of the novel for me is about the fact that there are some types of pain that you can't even talk about, right? Or that it's very difficult to talk about. And so that was why I wanted to spend so much time kind of diving into the heads and minds of these characters, because they can't do it for themselves. So I guess I thought that was my job.
We're taking a short break. We're taking a short break.
For me, this book, oh, beautiful. So for me, I was thinking about The ways in which we think about grief, right? We think about, like you're saying, for a lot of these characters, the grief is a void, an absence of something, right? But we also see that they try to fill this void in various ways, right? So you think about Chibuke, for instance, who becomes an alcoholic because there is no way to package and confront the ways in which he's supposed to deal with this grief, and also the constraints of what he understands masculinity to be is I can't go to therapy, I can't cry, I can't do all of these things, so I'm going to drink, right? And then you think about Ekene, who grieves like a lost relationship that he would never have, but also a relationship he wants, but he doesn't think he's worthy of. And so what he does in the place of that is that he fills this grief, this loss with sex, right? And I wanted to speak a little bit about that, right? The ways in which we shy away from the real problem, which is to deal with the inner world of ourselves, and how that kind of is taken away by the manifestations of the world we find ourselves in, right? So you think about Chibuke, who he may want to try and leave alcohol, right? But it's just, it feels more constant than anything else in his life, right? And with Ekene, sex seems more simpler than just confronting what he feels. And I wanted to speak a little bit about the kind of clutches we hold onto instead of dealing with the things we have to.
That's so true. I used to be a secondary school teacher, and when I was talking to boys, I taught in a boys' school for a while, and when I was talking to them about how to have conversations with each other and how to be open and to avoid exactly the kind of things that I'm writing about, because it's such a well-studied phenomenon that men don't talk to each other. There are statistics around this that are very sad, that men don't talk to each other, we don't talk about our problems, we bottle things up, and we have alarmingly high rates of suicide and the attendant problems that come along, even if suicide is not the eventual sort of outcome. And so when I was talking to boys about this, I would say, you are going to talk about your feelings one way or another. It might not be with words, but it might be with alcohol, it might be with violence, it might be with something else. But that was the way that I approached it. And I think that was what I was trying to do with this novel, is to show that even though Chibuke feels as though he doesn't have the words to talk about his feelings, or he doesn't have permission to talk about them as a man, that doesn't mean that he's not talking about it, doesn't mean that he's not expressing it, right? If he's drinking and if he's getting drunk on the tube or just alone in his house, he's still talking about his experiences and his problems. And similarly with Ekene, he might not feel as though he can put his sadness into words, or that he'd be listened to if he did, but he's still talking about it if he's displaying these, I guess, what we would call avoidant behaviors. And if he's running away from love, he's still talking about his childhood. He's still talking about his feelings of low self-worth and a feeling that he doesn't belong. And I think I guess I was trying to evoke an inevitability with the novel. I think that there can be something distressing about this idea that our bodies do things that we don't want them to do. And I think certainly that is something that we have that causes a lot of problems. I think we like to think that the body is more under our control than it really is. And I think that when we encounter illness or death, sometimes that leaves us a little bit lost for words or a little bit unprepared, because we don't like to think that these things happen. And that's a very human and understandable thing to do. But I think that for me, I guess one of the healing things about writing this novel was that I was looking at the flip side of that as well. And that actually, just as much as our bodies do things, it can be scary when our bodies do things that we don't want them to, or that we don't expect. Sometimes there can be something redeeming about that, I think. When there's a moment in the novel when two characters realize that they have a love for one another and that they want to care for each other. And it's just a small gesture of drawing a blanket over somebody when they're sleeping. But I wanted that to express the fact that our bodies are capable of loving, even if we didn't expect them to. We can be extraordinarily loving and caring beyond our expectations. And that for me is the flip side of the fact that illness and death and addiction are also scary realities in life.
I love that you've just said that, because I've been thinking a lot, particularly in this book, about the weight of regret. And I think that regrets is something that echoes through the book, but we see people deal with regret differently, right? So I think people come to terms with mortality in this book, and often what happens is it takes death for us to realize that like time is finite, but also that time is illusionary, right? So you always feel like you have more time, but you don't. But I'm interested in the theme of regrets because we see almost the uselessness of regrets in this book, right? Because it doesn't propel people to be better, right? So people experience profound loss, they experience profound changes just even in the ways that they're able to relate with each other. And they're deeply regretful for the ways in which they treat each other. But there's almost a uselessness to that emotion because it doesn't propel them to be better, right? Or we see them use regrets is almost use regrets as this refuge. So it's this place that you go to affirm that you're actually a horrible person, but do nothing about it. And I am so intrigued by the ways in which you use the theme of regrets in this book, because at times, and the clock on all knows, I was so infuriated with two of the characters in this book. Ikene, but Ikene and Chibuko almost wallow in regret, right? Pre and even post loss, right? And I just want to know what you were hoping to do in writing about the weight of regret in the way that you did in this book.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think that's so true. I think regret or guilt, however you want to think about that emotion, it's a very natural human emotion that hopefully many of us feel at certain times in our lives, but I'm not sure how useful it is for changing action. I think, don't get me wrong, I think it's important to have a conscience, but one of the things that I think came out of the murder of George Floyd and the sort of reaction in England and in the US, from what I could see, to that was there was a lot of white guilt, right? There was a lot of, I got messages from people asking how to be a better white person. And you can see a lot of people floundering online about, do I put up a black square? Do I do this? Do I do that? And one of the things that Rini Edo-Lodge talks about in her book, Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race, is that actually we don't necessarily want white people to feel guilt. We want change. We want action. We want healing and reparations. Guilt by itself, actually, I think it is surprisingly easy to live with. Certainly in my novel, we've got characters who live with guilt for a long period of time and don't necessarily actually do anything to change. What changes them is not this kind of nagging feeling in their mind that they're not being great people. What changes them is love and opportunity and need and inevitability, right? It isn't guilt. And I think that is probably quite true of life in general. I think that what changes people in the short term is guilt. People put up their black squares, they bought books that maybe they hadn't thought about reading before. I think a lot of Black writers experienced increased sales during the aftermath of George Floyd's murder. But in terms of change, we still have a prime minister who, despite the fact that he is not white, is not supportive, I believe, of positive change in terms of race and racism and equality in the broader sense. I think our society is still troublingly regressive in a lot of ways. There were statistics that came out in the UK that said that young men are increasingly likely to be right-wing, but more so perhaps even than their elders, which might be surprising to a lot of people. So this idea that guilt is this like transformative thing, I think it's very easy to think of that, especially when you come from a religious context like I do, right? You feel guilty, you confess, you go to church, you confess your sins and you're absolved. But I think outside of that context, and perhaps in just life generally, I think we need to take a look at guilt and how useful it is and where it really leads us, if anywhere.
I love that. I find that in the book, you make a lot of commentary about masculinity and about men in general, right? Like whether it's in the context of a heterosexual world, also in the context of a queer world, right? Like I think I want to say you ask difficult questions of men, which I think they may not become capable and also comfortable of wanting to confront and answer, right? A number of times you say men are like this, right? Sort of as a statement, there's a commentary, right? Like there seems to be this impenetrable kind of fault that they impose on themselves. So like men are like this, yeah, but you found me like this type of thing. And I thought about the question that you ask in the book, could there be more than distance and sex between men? As this call to really difficult conversations that men should have around intimacy, right? Whether it is platonic, sexual intimacy, and vulnerability. But I think particularly also you ask this of queer men, right? I think the relationship between two of the main characters as queer men is that could there be really more than distance between them and sex, right? But also this big, large commentary about men are like this, right? This idea that like men could be more, right? I feel like in many ways, the book for me feels queer, not in its identity, but in its orientation, to be like, can we think about better ways of inhibiting masculinity? And I wanted us to speak a little bit about that, kind of what you wanted to achieve by these larger commentaries of men are like this, but also asking these difficult questions about distance and sex.
Yeah, thank you so much for picking up on that. I think that so the statements I guess I was making about what men are like and men are like this, those when they're focalized through a particular character. I think it's Ekene who is like realizing that men are cold and firm and intractable and ungiving and unforgiving, and I think a lot of that has come from my experience of growing up and seeing role models, if you like. I wouldn't call them role models, because I wouldn't even necessarily say that I had any male role models as such, but men in the public sphere, men who I've been close to growing up or who I've seen. I think masculinity so often is seen in its purest form as being intractable, as being fixed, ungiving, uncompromising, and that can be really scary to live with. I think it doesn't reflect how I see myself or the men I admire. It doesn't get you anywhere, I think, in life, and it causes a lot of pain. I think that there's a writer, John Paul Brammer, who I really love, who's written about masculinity in lots of really interesting ways. And one of the things he says is that masculinity, certainly for queer people, it is this thing that demands so much of you in this very intractable, ungiving way, and gives you so little in return. It demands that you stand a certain way, that you don't hold hands with that person, you don't wear this thing that you might want to wear, you don't paint your nails, this, that, and the other. And what do you get in return for giving up all those things that make you feel free and make you feel yourself? You get, at best, a questionable promise of safety, right? Because even if you obey all those rules and you give this up and you don't do this and you don't do that, you're never really safe as a queer person from that jibe or that insult or this violence. And I think that what Brammer says about that is absolutely true. And I guess when I was writing this book, I was trying to say there is something really unfair about that deal. It's such a raw deal that we as queer people are forced into and fixed into. And so I love what you said about the queerness of the novel, because that's exactly what I was trying to do. I think I had in my mind a clear sense of what kind of novel I did and didn't want to write. I knew I didn't want to write a coming-of-age novel, not because that was bad, but because I feel that people have done that brilliantly and that wasn't my ministry. I didn't want to cover that ground again. That was what I was trying to do. So when Achike and Ekene form this relationship that is, even I don't really have a name for it, but when they form this relationship that exists outside of family and romantic relationships and what they have both been told that love and relationships can be, that was what I was trying to do. I was trying to write something deeply queer.
We're taking a short break.
Did you ever grow up wondering who the gay kid in your high school was, only to find out later it was you the whole time?
You ever find yourself staring in religion class at Jesus' abs?
Did you ever run a hair braiding station in the sheep barn at your county fair?
And have you ever met a gay person from Montana? Well, now you know too.
I'm Isaac.
And I'm Tyler.
And if this sounds like you, you should definitely check out There Are No Gays in Montana, the podcast where we talk about all things growing up gay in rural America.
Plus, along the way, hear our story of how we went from straight best friends to roommates to, yep, you guessed it, husbands.
You can listen to There Are No Gays in Montana on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen.
The parents in this book are... the parents in this book.
Yeah.
Let's talk about knows. I find certain things striking now that I have become a parent myself. Like, certain things are almost unimaginable to me. And I suppose something that I found particularly interesting in this book was how each of the parents in this book leave. We speak often about paternal abandonment because we see so much of fathers leaving their children. Often it's physical. Fathers leave the house, or in Achike's case, fathers leave because they're present, but they're not presence of spirits, they're not present in understanding, they're not present in ways that are important, right, that are tangible. But the mothers in this book leave in very interesting ways. Ekene's mother decides that he reminds her too much of her relationship, but also her personal failings, right? Because often we feel that this is why people defend their partners to the death, right? Because you feel that so much of who you are, so much of what you think of yourself is reflected in your partner, right? And so when your partner does things that are questionable, that is in fact a reflection of you. And this is why people will defend to the death their partners. But there is a way in which Achike's mother leaves that is almost unimaginable, right? Achike is the victim of childhood sexual abuse, and Achike's mother makes a very particular decision to leave because that doesn't fit the narrative of what she would expect, or the narrative of silence. And so I wanted to speak a little bit about that because I feel like the parental abandonment in this book is what sets the scene for how Achike and Ekene abandon each other later on, right? Because there is an abandonment that they do, and there's almost like this genealogy of abandonment that runs throughout the book, but it's because we see the parents abandon their children, but we see those very children having been abandoned themselves. So those parents themselves have been abandoned, right? Chibuke's father dies when he's very young, and of course, that's not an intentional abandonment, but his father leaves nonetheless. So there's this genealogy of children being left behind that carries throughout the book. And I'm interested in that because parental abandonment is an interesting case for me. I think about how it completely alters children's relationships in the future, but also in the present. So I was hoping that we could contrast the abandonments that we see in the book and why you felt it was important to write the mothers in the way that you did, right? To not write them as these like characters who are just in the way that Black women are almost caricatured, because Black mothers are just, oh my God, they can do no wrong, when we know the reality of it is not. And you chose to write against that, and I thought that was interesting.
Thank you. Yeah, I think, God, you've covered so much interesting stuff there. The genealogy of abandonment, I haven't heard that phrase before, but I think it's absolutely correct. Because I guess what I was writing against is when we think this book is very much about family and different ways of thinking about family. The writer Armistead Maupin has this phrase. He talks about your biological family and then you have your logical family. And sometimes those are the same thing and sometimes they're not. And when we think about biological family or family of origin, I think a lot of the time we think about it with rose-tinted glasses, this nuclear family, mother, father, children, it's perfect. Everybody loves everybody. Everybody has their roles and they stick to them and everybody's happy. And I think a lot of the time when we pursue that with this, I think, misguided idea that there's a genealogy of it going backwards through time, and it's always looked the same way, that families always look the same way, and it's always worked the same way, and it has always worked. When actually, if we are more honest with ourselves, about history and society, what we see about family is that family is made up of human beings, and human beings make mistakes or die or don't know how to do certain things because they weren't given those skills, or they don't know what certain relationships ought to look like because they weren't given them themselves in childhood. And I wanted to write against that. Chibike, when he's growing up, his mum and dad got together in this really traditional way. Like his dad like flirted with his mum and made this kind of cheeky come online, and she acquiesced, and it was romantic and sweet, and they fell in love and got married, and that was that. Until things went wrong, right? He died and her family didn't support her because they didn't really like him in the first place. And then what does that mean about what she has to do when she's got young kids that she needs to provide for? And I wanted to write against this idea of the traditional nuclear family. It's always been complicated. It has always been complicated. In fact, the novel came in large part from the Book of Ruth in the Old Testament, which is about two women who form what we would now call the chosen family. Ruth is Naomi's daughter-in-law, but when the men in their family, something happens to the men in their family that tears them apart. And I don't want to spoil it for anybody who hasn't read the novel, but Naomi says to her daughter-in-law, Ruth, now is the time for you to go back to your parents' home. Traditionally, you don't belong with me anymore. And she sends her away. And Ruth says, no, please don't send me away. Where you go, I will go. Your God will be my God. And they form this very powerful, close bond that has nothing to do with family anymore. They're not related anymore. But Ruth and Naomi help each other find food. They look after one another. They protect each other. And I wanted to write about that, this idea that we might think that family always looks a certain way, but it really doesn't always have to look a certain way. And I think that's quite freeing. And I guess that's what I was trying to do with the portrayal of women and mothers as well. I think it's so easy for us to think about, like you said, especially with Black women, who place so much weight on Black women, right? This expectation that Black women are like earth mothers and perfect at doing all of the most traditional things that women are supposed to do, certainly in a domestic sphere. And that is really limiting and violent and unfair. Achike's mother, she does not want to be a mother. And she makes that clear. She doesn't want to have children, certainly not yet. She likes her work and she doesn't want to have to stop doing that. And she doesn't want anything to interrupt that. And it's because in her husband's mind, there is no understanding of what a woman and a wife ought to do and be that doesn't include being a mother. There's just no way to have that conversation. He just doesn't understand it. And so they end up having this child. And I also wanted to write against the idea, because there is this kind of pervasive belief that, oh, just have children and everything will turn out okay. Just have them. You might not want them, but just have them and then everything will be fine. And this idea, especially for women, that any doubts or misgivings or reluctance you might have about having children is this temporary thing that just needs to be overcome by the fact of having a child. And I think that's really a really harmful belief for both mother and child. I think it means that you've got children who are, sometimes I'm sure it does work out. I'm sure there are plenty of parents who have children and, not having wanted them before, realize that it's an experience that is perfect for them and full of joy, and they adapt to it and they learn and they grow and they develop, and that's great. But for a lot of people, it doesn't necessarily work out that way. Sometimes people just don't want to have children, and that is fine and they should be listened to. And so what I wanted to write about, I guess, was how destructive it can be for people who, when people are forced one way or another into this kind of conventional nuclear family structure that doesn't work for them. Ndidi is trying to protect her idea of family. This idea of family, I think, can be really destructive because, as you say, Achike, her son, experiences abuse, sexual abuse at the hands of her brother, and she wants to protect him, her brother, because she thinks that's what family is. Family to her is preservation of the family unit at the expense of the individual. And that was another way of me trying to say, look, I know that we put nuclear family on a pedestal, but there's a lot wrong with it that we need to examine and move away from. And so that was my way of preparing the ground for the fact that the novel's going to move away from the idea of a nuclear family, that love doesn't have to exist within these very set boundaries of who you're married to, or who your parents are, or who your siblings are, or that it can exist within those contexts, but it can definitely exist outside of them. And I wanted to show another way of looking at things, because I think that so much of queerness for me is saying these rules don't work, these constraints don't work, these traditions don't work. Let's try something different. What about these other things that people have been doing for a long time, and maybe that would work for us as well.
And now this is where we start fighting.
I'm ready. I'm not even going to fight you. Just go ahead. Say your piece.
They're gathering themselves because they have.
I need to, because what I found really interesting was just this little hovering feeling of like intimacy, but not really intimacy, right? So you think about Amos and Ndubisi, right? For instance, you describe them in the book as two thieves stealing the day, right? Like they're so engrossed in each other's company that they don't even realize when Chubeke comes, right? But even the way Chubeke describes their relationship is like a relationship. These people were very close to each other, right? And Amos only married because he had to marry my mom, but he never really had anyone else. But they were very close to each other. And it was the way in which they looked at each other, these stolen glances, right? And I feel like Ekene and Achike's relationship also does that, right? Yes, we know about the infamous night in Berlin, which in my mind should have changed stuff. But you know what? You hate us, so they didn't change it. But it seems what I think the exploration in the book that you were trying to do, which you spoke about earlier, is like queerness not in a sex, but queerness in its orientation. So it feels, and perhaps it is true, that for certain queer people, we may never find love in the way that we want to. I feel like there was a tinge, it was foreshadowed in Amos and Ndubisi's relationship, but I think it was frontal in Ekene and Achike's relationship, because in many ways, they were always on the cusp of something, right? But we know Ekene constantly said that he was unlovable, effectively, and I don't want to ruin it. And we may understand it today as like kind of some form of abandonment, right? Like avoidant behavior, right? Avoidant attachment. But I'm interested in that, right? That like the characters, particularly the queer characters or people who may participate in queer loving, are always at the cusp, but never really there. And I think also you think about Oscar, but we're going to talk about Oscar a little bit later because I'm ready to fight as well, right? but just that, it felt like it was almost there, but never quite.
Yeah, so I dedicated the novel to anybody who's ever stood on the edge of something. And I had a few different meanings in mind for that. I was thinking about people who've been ostracized or who felt abandoned. I was thinking about people who have stood at the brink of transformative of something with a huge change in their lives, like Chibike does when he's deciding what kind of man he's going to be. But I was also definitely thinking about people who've Achike and Ekene and Ndubisi and Amos, who've almost experienced, who's come close to what they want and never quite had it, because I think that can be a really sad and lonely place to be. And I guess what I was trying to do is a few things, really. I was looking at the fact that, I don't know about you, but certainly when I was younger, I was told that being queer is not African, that it's this thing that is not right. It's insane. We have this ridiculous ahistorical notion that queerness is an import from the British Empire. And it's just not true. It's just not true. And so I was trying to write against that, this idea that being trans or gay or bi or lesbian or whatever it is just arrived in the last however many years, and there's like a white European thing. And I wanted to show, look, there are people who have loved each other in a queer way historically. This is not something that's just like happened yesterday. I didn't invent it, and I'm not responsible for it, because I think often when people tell that narrative, it pushes, not only does it suggest that being queer is wrong, but it pushes responsibility for that wrongness onto your shoulders. When actually, if we look at history, A, it's not wrong, and B, it's not just me, and that becomes much more freeing. You're sharing a heritage rather than shouldering a burden. So I wanted to write about that in that sense that would hopefully be quite freeing. But I also had to be realistic. I didn't want to suggest that Nigeria has ever been a haven of, it's never been paradise. There's no such thing as paradise on earth, right? Every human society has its faults and flaws and shortcomings. And I wanted to be honest about that, and the fact that for Amos and Ndebisi, they have this kind of attraction and intimacy that, you're right, never is quite fulfilled. And that's partly because there is no societal recognition for them at the time about space for them to occupy together lovingly, that there's no space for them to be who they really are completely. And that is partly because of legislation, but I think it's also because of societal, it's bigger than legislation. There's been this huge focus on gay marriage, and this idea, I think, in some quarters, that if we can just get gay marriage, that means everything's fine. I've had some really saddening and worrying conversations with people who think that because we've got gay marriage now, we're fine, we're all equal and everything's okay. And I don't think that's true. I think if you look at mental and physical health outcomes, I think if you look at violence, if you look at addiction rates, all sorts of things, queer people in this country are really badly off compared to their cishet counterparts. And I think that it goes even beyond that to things like the relationships that I write about in this novel. Just because we are living in England and we have gay marriage and we think we're so civilized, but that doesn't mean that we're better or that everything is perfect. For Ekene and Achike, there's still a long way for them to go, because they're still carrying these scars, these burdens of the way that they were raised and the way that they were abandoned, the things that they've been taught about love. And not just by their parents, but by wider society, right? There's just, even Oscar, who is white, has very similar ideas, I think, to an unreformed Chibike about what it is to be a man. He's ungiving, he's uncompromising in a lot of ways, he's unloving. And nevertheless, he's also very successful in a lot of ways. I think the world rewards that kind of man a lot in the workplace, financially. I think there's an idolatry of that kind of man. I hear we think about people like Andrew Tate and the kind of masculinity that he preaches. And even if I think I think there are men who, even if they wouldn't align themselves with Andrew Tate, still, I think his ideology doesn't come out of nowhere. I think that the popularity of it doesn't come out of nowhere. And I guess I was trying to write the kind of pervasiveness of some of those ways of thinking about men that are very constrained throughout a lot of men. And it doesn't just include straight men. We like to think that queer men are free of a lot of the nonsense that traditional masculinity kind of preaches. And in a lot of ways we are, or can be, but we are still prone to falling into some of those traps of thinking what men have to be. And we still sometimes struggle with talking about our feelings and these kind of basic things that can be life-saving. And I guess I wanted to be honest about that. And yeah, I guess no wonder this book is so sad, right? Because there's so much in this that is just unfair. But yeah. So I'm not going to fight you. It's a very sad book. And what I will say is that it's not only a sad book. I hope that there's much more within it. But what I will say is that I've heard from a lot of people who've had very similar responses to you, that where they've had to put the book down after a certain thing happens and come back to it, maybe even months later, A lot of people have told me that, actually, and I just appreciate it when people come back to it.
So speaking of dispelling particular notions, I think I've been reading a lot about love. I don't know if it's because I am in love. But I don't know why the Tlakonolo is making that face.
Exactly. I want you to own it. I want you to own it. Not this like feeling, I don't know if I'm in love. No, girl, own it. It's because
No, I didn't say I don't know. I didn't say I don't know if I'm in love. Please, my husband listens to this podcast. I didn't say I don't know if I'm in love. Please, I didn't say that. Don't misquote me. I didn't say I don't know if I'm in love. I said I don't know if I'm interested, if I've become more interested in love or in the writing of love because of my own profound experience of it, or because we're having conversations around loneliness and I'm seeing people's desire for love. So let the record state that there is no sense of
there is not thinking. Yeah, I agree.
around the love. Please, yay. But my husband listens to this podcast. I must be very clear on these things.
Right, yeah.
But there is this notion around love is the thing that's infallible, right? It's infinite, it's strong, and it's able to conquer all things, right? And because of these notions around its infallibility and its ability to conquer, there's almost a careless way in which people treat love, right? It almost gets treated as a thing that will always be there because Tlhogonolo and I love each other, and we almost that presupposes any sort of behavior or any kind of way that I may behave, right? Because this idea of soulmates, which has been sold to us by Disney and Netflix and an ad, is like your soulmate will always be there. It doesn't matter how trashy and terrible as a person you may be, love conquers all. You write against this notion in the book, right? Because we see Achike and Ekene love each other deeply, but they're always just standing at the precipice. Nobody wants to make the jump and to do the courageous thing, which is what love demands of you, right? Is that
Especially Ekene.
Especially Ekene, of course.
True.
Ekene is a problem child, but it's fine. But they always stand at the precipice because there is a courage required that nobody really wants to exert. Yeah. And you further complicate this because you also then add the reality of time, right? Because time, we always think of time as this thing that happens to other people but doesn't happen to us, right? So other people get older, other people lose opportunities, other people lose out on things related to time. And I want to know why you wrote about love as this thing that isn't all of the things that I've spoken to, why you wrote against the notion of love in the way that you did in this book, but why you also wrote about time in the way that you did, because we see time, because people always say, oh, time is not linear, or everything at everybody's pace. But you write against that reality in the book. And I think that in a space where, like a novel, where time can be anything, you wrote about it in one of the most realistic ways possible. And I'm curious about why you chose to make those kind of literary and editorial decisions.
Also, to be honest, like if someone had to die, like if you had to kill someone, it wasn't the person.
You could have killed so many people.
It wasn't the person.
You do not have a shortage of people who you could have killed in this book.
Drunkard of a father.
And actually, before you answer that question, we need to confront you. We actually need to confront you because you could have killed so many people in this book. You kill Achike, who, no, I need to confront Okechukwu. Achike is... I'm sorry, because I was traumatized, okay? I cried over this book. Achike is a childhood sexual abuse survivor. We see Achike begin to ascend in his 30s, which is unusual for an actor. It's unusual for a person who's famous, right? You don't often see people break out at 37. And there's a reason why we think about Forbes 30 under 30, and there's all this preoccupation, people reaching ascendancy at a particular point. Achike goes against that. Achike's star begins to ascend. Achike is starting to attend therapy. Achike is finding healing, right? Even in his relationship with Chibuke, they are finding meaning for why they are the way that they are, but also they're beginning to find each other, right? And Achike then gets his life cut short, right? And it just feels like often this is what happens to queer people, women, people who experience difficult lives, particularly Black people who experience difficult lives. We often just never see them get what they deserve, right? We never, it's almost like you're always at the precipice. These people are always just about to make it, and it just never happens for them. And Achike is that person, right? Then has this subarachnoid hemorrhage, and Achike dies, but Achike dies before the film is even shown. Like, no, Okechukwu, answer. Why?
Do you know what?
I'm so
not even
mad
going to fight you.
Like, for that, I'm very mad at you.
And you should be mad at me. And I, I'm not going to fight you on that. I get it. And I think I knew that I was writing something that would be unusual when you kill off a main character a third of the way through the novel. I don't think I realized just how strong people's reactions would be to it when they read it. And maybe that's my fault. Maybe I should have been a bit less short-sighted. But it means a lot to me that people have had such strong reactions. It really does, because that means that you've really, the character, you and the character have touched each other, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. And that really matters to me a lot. So thank you for reading it and letting Achike in. And I'm sorry to have been so cruel. I guess there are a few reasons why it worked out that way. The first is that it began as a rewriting of the Book of Ruth. And that meant a lot to me in different ways, because it's a biblical story. I was raised in the church, but I've left the church and I found happiness outside of the church. And so for me to write that story, but gay, was a really healing thing for me to do. And I think you're absolutely right as well, that so often queer people, Black people, we don't get all the things that we deserve. And I wanted to be realistic about that, because I knew I couldn't write the kind of novel where everybody gets everything they want. I think as queer writers, we have such a difficult line to tread. We don't want to write something that is saccharine and too easy, but we also don't want to write the cliche tragic queer novel where, somebody dies of AIDS right away, or if somebody gets gay bashed and dies right away. I didn't want to do that. And so it was important to me that when Achike did die, it was not related to his queerness. His death was not a result of his queerness. It was something that could happen to anybody. And that kind of goes back to what you were saying earlier about time. It was interesting when I was researching this novel, I spoke to a friend of mine who's a doctor, and she was telling me that the brain hemorrhage that Achike has, it is one of the few things that, if you have that and you go into A&E, it's one of the few things where there's very little that doctors can do for you. And it can happen to anybody. And I thought that is so profound, because, again, it goes back to what we were saying before about how sometimes your body just does things that are completely unfair, that you don't want it to do, that you don't expect it to do. And I think that reminds us of our vulnerability, and it can be so scary and so terribly unfair. But I wanted to write Achike as completely human, and this felt like part of that. And also, I think that it's probably a personal thing to me. I think that growing up, like a lot of queer people, I've come a long way in terms of my being, my mental health, and my sense of myself. And I was always aware of that as a journey. Even before I started having therapy in my 20s, I was in my late teens, really. I was always aware of that kind of how far I had to go to be happy, out of what you're taught about being queer, what you're taught about what you can access and what you deserve. I was very aware of that very long road ahead of me. And the thing that terrified me most was that I wouldn't ever get that. For some reason, I wouldn't get to complete it. And I don't really know where that comes from, besides just the flip side of hope. I suppose sometimes the flip side of hope is that you're worried that something's going to get in the way of that. When often people talk about when they've signed a book deal, they'll be terrified that they're going to get hit by a bus the day before the book comes out. And I think maybe that was my way of exercising that demon. But you also, what you said about time, I think is absolutely right. There's something very just realistic about the fact that sometimes time runs out on us before we get to do or see or have the things that we want and deserve. But I also wanted to write a novel which, as well as acknowledging the finality of time in certain respects, I wanted to write around that and beyond that and think about how in traditional Igbo culture, this idea of reincarnation and the idea that even if you die, you're still reborn into another person, and that is a kind of second chance, that it's that what is this kind of, it's almost a cliche, what is born can never die, you can never, and this idea in physics that I was referencing in the novel, that you can never, energy can never be created, it can only ever be transformed. So I wanted that to be, to those two things to exist alongside one another, because I think if there's one thing that queer people need and deserve, it's second chances and looking at mirror images of ourselves through time.
I just think, is this where we stop? I think this has been something that it's been playing in my mind probably for most, if not all of my life. And I think you do this quite brilliantly when we think about Ekene's character, right? Ekene constantly speaks about the idea of being unlovable. And I feel that in many kind of queer life, the world has taught us that we are unlovable, that we are not a thing to be loved, right? And so for many of us, we've internalized as not being a thing to be loved. And so we've attached our queerness as part of this unlovability. And it kind of seems to wrestle quite a bit with that, right? Even in the moment where we are at the precipice of him knowing that he does love Achike, he has the ability to be good and to be all of these things. But I think part of what holds him back is this deep-seated belief that has been ingrained in him by society, that he's unlovable. And I wanted to speak a little bit about that, just like how, in as much as we want a queer utopia, I think the beauty of Here Again Now is also the reality of, for many of us, we are Ekene, right? We are Ekene. We may have little dalliances in the city, but ultimately, at its core, we don't want to be loved because we deeply believe that we are unlovable. And I wanted to speak a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think that is a big part of who Ekene is, and I think that comes from a number of places. His experience with his parents, his mother was in-loving, I guess would be the best way to put it, and the same with his father. And I think that also is reflected by the wider world in terms of how gay people are received in the UK and also very much in Nigeria and even in Hollywood, right? Ekene and Achike both wanted to be actors and they both loved doing it, but Achike, who is lighter skinned, is the one who experiences commercial and professional success in a way that Ekene doesn't. And I think that it's easy for these things to weigh down on you and for you to let those messages of what the world is telling you in. But I also wanted to write against that and to write much more hopefully, because the relationship that Ekene and Chibike have and that it is a very profound love, but it's not the kind of love that Ekene ever thought he was going to get, and it's not the kind of love that he ever taught to hope for, right? Disney doesn't tell you that maybe one day you'll grow up and meet somebody who is like a father figure to you and you'll love each other and look after each other and help each other grow and heal. That's not really, there's no Valentine's card with that message on it. It's not very marketable. Sometimes chasing a dream can be great, but sometimes having narrow expectations of what love will look like and happiness will look like can hold you back. And I look at Ekene's story as a really hopeful one because he finds wonderful things within himself and within other people that he didn't expect to. And I didn't want to end the novel with him like falling in love and getting married, but that's not because I don't think those things are possible for him. I just didn't want that to be the crowning joy of his life. For me, the crowning joy of his life is that he's able to experience love in a really deep way, as deep as possible for a human being, I think. And he's able to be really fully known, flaws and all, and loved as he is. And who knows, maybe he will meet somebody, maybe he won't. But for me, what is most important is that he experiences love in a way that he wasn't expecting to. I think for me, that's more hopeful and more important.
And I think also, like, it feels like a proclamation about there are more immediate manifestations of love apart from romance. It felt a lot for me like that, like the idea that, like, love is everywhere essentially, and like, if you give it an opportunity, even those parts of yourself that you couldn't heal will be healed, right? Because it is about the importance of kind of chosen family and how it's important for us to begin to build a life that our younger selves could not, right? To begin to make decisions. Because I feel in many ways, this book is profoundly sad, right? But I do think that the ultimate message of the sadness is that we can choose differently, both for these two problematic people who I think could have rather died and Achike could have been alive. Their chosen family can be something that's deeply healing, right? Yeah.
Do you know, now that we've spoken actually about that chosen family, I was thinking a lot about like the divergence of life paths because of something that you said earlier, right? So Okechukwu, that was Achike and Ekene both want to be actors, but there's a dream deferred for Ekene, right? So Ekene defers this dream because of colorism and because of all the things that we know that he may have also internalized about himself. But I think about how do relationships and love thrive when the trajectories of those individuals in them look so different? And why I think of that particularly is because Ekene asks himself, will Achike want to be friends with someone like me? Will he want to have someone like me in his life as his star continues to ascend? And of course, we'll never know because Achike's trajectory is cut short in a particular way. But you ask questions that I am grappling with. No shade, but shade.
I said, we don't know because he be dead.
No shade, but shade, right? Yeah, do you know, that wasn't even intentional, Okechukwu. I was just so hurt by Achike that, I had to just remind you. But I'm curious about that because I think foundationally we believe that we have to be similar in many ways in order to have certain relationships thrive. And you write against that. And I was hoping that before we close, you can answer the question around how relationships in life would have thrived in this setting when it seems like the outcomes are so different for each of these individuals. Even life is so completely different to what it would look like for even Ekene, right? How does love and how do relationships and family thrive in those spaces of difference?
So this, I think, comes from one of my favorite writers growing up was Jane Austen. And I think the way that we think about Jane Austen today has been romanticized and maybe simplified a lot of the time. We think of her as writing the original love stories. But I think that she was also really complex. I think her novels are really complex. And what I take away from them, one of the things I take away from her novels is that when you love somebody, you love them you bring all of yourself to that love, even if you don't do that intentionally, right? You might be in love with somebody, but that doesn't mean that you are no longer insecure or repressed or afraid. These things that I think you mentioned this earlier, the fact that we have this very romanticized idea of love. And what I love about Jane Austen is that, for example, with Emma Woodhouse, this character she's a know-it-all and she interferes in people's business and she doesn't really respect people and she's a snob. And that stuff doesn't go away just because she's in love with Mr. Knightley. That doesn't change her completely. In fact, what she has to do is take a good look at herself and think, actually, what bits of me need to change in order for me to be in a relationship with this person that I love and for us both to be happy. And that's what I wanted to bring to this novel. You think about, you mentioned the fact that Achike and Ekene, they have these very different careers, and that is not really a result of talent or hard work. And I guess for me, writing this novel, writing about actors was a way of me writing about writers and the mechanics of writing and publishing. I've been very fortunate to have the publisher that I have, but I think fortunate is the word that comes to mind, because I met my publisher more or less by chance. My work was introduced to her more or less by chance. There was a mutual sort of contact who gave her my work and said, I think you'll like this. Had I not had that, maybe I wouldn't have had this Black publisher who understands what I'm trying to do and who has faith in my work and has allowed me to write these stories. And I think that we don't talk about the mechanics of art enough. We like to think of art as this kind of airy fairy thing that kind of happens in your bedroom and suddenly you become massively successful. Actually, that isn't, I don't think that's the case. I think often the successes of art or otherwise of art are very much to do with these arbitrary mechanical things of who has the money, who knows these people, who doesn't know those people, what color is your skin, what gender are you, how old are you. These things have nothing to do with how talented you are or how hard you work. And there are people who break those boundaries every day, but there are people who don't get the chance to. And I wanted to be honest about that and to write about the fact that has its repercussions and ripples throughout life. But at the same time, I guess going back to what I said earlier about bringing all of yourself to love, one of the things that I love writing most is love and dialogue across boundaries and across distance. And I think that one of the most profound things about really being in love with somebody is that, yes, you bring your whole self, but you also have a really good look at your whole self as well. And you think, okay, I've been holding on to this pain or this anger or this way of looking at the world, and maybe that doesn't serve me anymore. And maybe actually being in love with somebody is my opportunity to grow and give a better version of myself to this person that I'm with, and indeed to myself while I'm with them. And that's what I wanted Ekene and Chibuike to do, not to become different people overnight, because I don't think that's how people work. But I think for me, one of the successes of their love is that it allows them to assess who they are and to leave behind bits that don't work for them anymore.
This has been such a wonderful conversation. Partly, I think we have to thank you for that, because Here Again Now has been, I think it's going to be one of our favorite books for 2024. I know it was published a while ago, but I think it's a book that should be in everyone's library, just because of the ways. I think it's the tenderness, right, that you've dealt with really difficult, tough. At the end of it, it's love, even for each one of these problematic people. At the end of it is you want us to see them in the hopeful light that you see them. And thank you for that. Thank you for what it was an absolutely beautiful novel. And this conversation also just added to, it warmed my little heart, because I'm like, yes, more. But thank you deeply so much from the Cheeky Natives for what has been a wonderful book, but also a really wonderful conversation.
And it just means so much to me. I can't really put it into words, but I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Okechukwu, and thank you for writing this book. I know that I wanted to fight you. But
you did, girl. You did. We fought a little.
You fought and you won.
We fought, but it was all love. I hope that the love and the appreciation for this book radiated throughout this conversation, because we're immensely grateful for the work that you did in Here Again Now, and we're so grateful for the work that this book is going to do even in the future. I know that there will be a child who picks up this book and feels seen, but that there's also going to be an adult who picks up this book and feels like their younger self is being seen, and that's healing. So thank you so much from the Cheeky Natives. We are so grateful for this conversation, and we look forward to hopefully more conversations in the future. And that's all
a happy ending next time, a happy ending. Like, really. Have a happy ending, please. For Alma.
Don't act like you were charmed by this ending, the Tokonolo. Please don't act like you and I were not in the same boat.
We were.
Anyway, thank you so much, Cheeky Natives. We'll see you next time. And thank you so much to Okechukwu for being so gracious and being so tender in this conversation.
Thank you both so much. Thank you.
Until next time, Chicken Natives, we're out.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Cheeky Natives. Don't forget to subscribe, review, and rate the podcast on all your streaming platforms.